once again, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining. We'll be starting in about 1 minute just to give people time to log on. This is our Protiviti and Robert Half Enterprise Resilience Forum, and we'll be starting very shortly. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our forum. It's great to see you all here, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. This is our Protiviti and Robert Half Enterprise Resilience Forum, and we're focused today on talking about diversity and inclusion. My name is Paul Middleton. I'm a Managing Director in Protiviti, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues from Protiviti, as well as by my colleagues from our sister company, Robert Half. As many of you know by now, this is our weekly collaboration forum, a forum for us all to collaborate and learn from each other. We started 17 weeks ago now, collaborating around the disruption caused to our businesses by COVID and how we remain resilient. But over the last few weeks, our focus has shifted, and we've talked a lot more about how we approach the future. And in particular, we've been discussing how we reimagine our future before we leap back into business as normal. Our aim remains consistent, however. We hope that you, by hearing the forum's insights, innovations and perspectives, will be able to join the dots to your own challenges, which will help you with your decision making and give you greater confidence to make the right decisions and to make them quickly. So last week we had a sports theme, and you heard around how various sports are coping and recovering. And we also heard around the importance of authentic leadership, sporting mindset, adapting in the face of adversity, focusing on the things we can control, and the criticality of diversity in the workplace. And it's this last point around diversity and inclusion that we've really wanted to focus on today. In this forum, we've talked many times about the importance of the people agenda, about a principled approach to managing our people and treating our people fairly, and the imperative of empowering our people and unlocking everyone's potential to help us as business leaders face a future with as much confidence as possible, with the broadest possible perspectives and the best possible ideas and innovations. So we've touched on the themes of diversity and inclusion almost every week.
Good morning. Paul, are you back on? I think Paul is having a technical glitch. I hope everyone can hear me. Good morning. My name is Layla Tyndall, your other host for this morning. I can see everybody nodding. Thank you, everyone. So for those that are still joining us, good morning and welcome to week 17 of our webinar. It is this week we are discussing diversity and inclusion. Paul was just doing an introduction there, so I'll step in while I'm sure he really looks back on. So I will wait for Paul to log back on to introduce some of the speakers.
Sorry about that.
But I just
not quite sure what happened there. Clearly my own setup here isn't quite as resilient as it needs to be, but so as I was saying, it's a very relevant time to turn ourselves towards diversity. We don't have to look far into the headlines today to see stories reflecting a historic and a current lack of inclusion and diversity, and see the hugely negative impact that the lack of inclusion and diversity has on society, businesses, and us as individuals. So I'm delighted to say that we have some wonderful panelists today who'll be able to unpack some of the key topics around diversity and inclusion and provide us with some insight and some really practical advice around how we can help make our own workplaces and worlds as diverse and as inclusive as possible. And I'll introduce them shortly. So before we kick off, a little bit about forum logistics as normal. We have over 100 people on, 120 people on this morning, clients, friends and partners on this call. Most of you, if not all of you, are connected to Protiviti or to Robert Half in some way, and it's great to see you all here. For those of you who don't know us, Protiviti is a change management consultancy, and we focus on technology, risk and internal audit. We specialize in managing the risks in your business, changing your businesses and helping you face the future with confidence. And so in partnership with Robert Half, we deliberately have a wide audience here on the forum from diverse industries and backgrounds, such as financial services, charities, manufacturing, food, public sector, retail, technology, hospitality, media, sports, and many, many more. As I say every week, this is your forum. So please share your perspectives, ask your questions, disagree, agree, give your point of view. Don't be afraid to say something controversial, but please interact and make the forum as useful and as meaningful for you as possible. You can ask those questions through speaking up. We deliberately don't mute people. You can unmute yourselves. Or as many of you prefer, just please use the chat function, and you'll see that for those of you who don't use Teams, just as part of the Teams bar at the bottom, just click on the chat icon and ask your question. For those of you who are dialing in on the phone, you may need to press *6 if you wish to say a question. And for those of you who wish to be very diplomatic, you can raise your hand in Teams, and I will try and come to you, assuming my Teams remains functioning and all good. Last week, we had an after party as we did a couple of weeks before. So for those of you who are available, we'll keep the lines open after 9 o'clock. So please feel free to join us then, and we'll continue the discussion. It's a more informal debate. So a quick introduction to our panelists then before we kick off. First, we have Dr. Grace Lorden. Grace is an associate professor in behavioural science at the London School of Economics and Political Science within the Psychological and Behavioural Science Department. Grace is an economist by background and founding director of the Inclusion Initiative, which is a 3-year programme bringing together research and practice to build more inclusive work environments. Grace's research is focused on understanding why some individuals succeed over others because of factors beyond their control, and brings expertise on the effects of unconscious bias, discrimination and technology changes. Grace has led projects to advise commissioners in the UK and policymakers in the EC, and we're delighted that she can join us today. We also have Olive Strachan, MBE, as one of our panelists. Olive is a global businesswoman, entrepreneur, and founder of Olive Strachan Resources, a coaching and training consultancy designing and delivering programs on leadership development and diversity and inclusion, conduct, culture, and group dynamics. Olive is an ex-chair of the Chartered Institute of Professional Development and has spent over 20 years developing managers and leaders across the world, particularly on the topic of diversity and inclusion. Olive was awarded an MBE in 2019 for her contribution to professional business services and was named as a Northern Powerhouse Woman in 2020 and an ambassador for women in the year 2020 as well. So we're delighted that Olive can join us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Harry Samuel. Until very recently, Harry was CEO of RBC Investor and Treasury Services and CEO for RBC Capital Markets in Europe. Harry now advises CEOs and boards of directors for companies in the banking, innovative finance and low carbon energy infrastructure sectors. He's also a guest lecturer at Said Business School at the University of Oxford. Harry's a long-standing advocate for diversity and inclusion in the workplace and was a signatory to the HM Treasury's Women in Finance Charter in 2017, and in 2010 he founded the RBC Academy, which provides training, internships and university scholarships for A-level students within inner London schools. Again, thank you very much for Harry for joining us today. Next we have David Levine, and until very recently David was Vice President of Kids Programming at Disney Channels in Europe and Africa and the UK and Ireland. In this role, David was responsible for all strategic and operational aspects of children's programming across all platforms. David commissioned all originally produced content, acquisitions and co-productions for Disney Kids platforms, including The Lodge, which featured the Disney Channel's first LGBT character. David serves as executive sponsor of the Pride UK and Ireland for Disney's LGBTQ employees, and serves as a trustee for anti-bullying charity Ditch the Label, and also features in the top 10 inspirational leaders in business LGBT awards for 2020. David joins us today from New Jersey on the east coast of the US, and we're very grateful he's taken the time to join us at what must be a very unsociable and dark hour for him at this time. So thank you, David. And lastly, I'm delighted to introduce Belton Flournoy. Belton is from Protiviti, and we're delighted to have him here. He's a director in Protiviti's technology consulting practice. And also within Protiviti, Belton founded our Protiviti UK Pride Network. Under his leadership, the network hosts various diversity and inclusion events at the Shard, and Belton recently won Best LGBT Plus Initiative by the Inclusive Tech Alliance. Belton volunteers with Pride in London, where he serves as head of Pride in the City, a mayor-backed initiative he founded in 2017, focused on increasing D&I within businesses. Like David, Belton features in the top 10 British inspirational LGBT leaders in 2020 and speaks and moderates at a large number of events on the D&I agenda. So welcome to all of our panelists today. There's a huge range of topics we can cover here, but Belton, if I could start with you maybe, sir. Over the past few weeks, Belton, we've mentioned diversity and inclusion so many times in this forum. What do you think the impact of the last 16 weeks of lockdown uncertainty has been on diversity and the diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Yes, Paul, thank you for that. And I guess maybe what I'll start with is telling you guys a little about Pride in the City, because I think it's very relatable to my understanding of why it's quite important. So Pride in the City is an initiative we worked with the Mayor of London City Khan to create. The goal of Pride in the City is really to increase the feeling of inclusivity across London with organizations by amplifying the LGBT voices and their allies within organization. A 2019 report by Involve indicated that 90% of people feel visible leaders are extremely important within their organizations. So we all know that we want visible leaders to exist. So Pride in the City really worked to try and make that connection. Since we started, we've impacted over 4,000 people, over 30 events. And what people sometimes don't realize is the impact that companies themselves can have on a person and their personal well-being. I've heard numerous times people mention work isn't the right place for us to discuss sexual orientation openly. I wholeheartedly disagree. With the focus on well-being, we understand that happy people create more productive outcomes. As a matter of fact, we know this also increases company revenues, with that number ranging anywhere between 10 and 31%, as a recent report indicated. So we know it's the right thing to do. We also know that less than 50% of people feel comfortable coming out at work today. That's according to the FT. The FT also says that 70% of people are likely to leave a company within 3 years if they're in a closet. And so the reason why I think that foundation is important is because we need to understand the lay of the land before COVID happened. We also know that two-thirds of millennials go back into the closet when they start a new job. I went back into the closet when I started a new job here in the UK, and I found myself in a situation where I was lying to everyone around me about who I was. And it became a big deal to tell the truth, even though I felt comfortable with the people around me. So it's really important that organizations are visible and open with how they show their support to employees. What we've seen over the past 17 weeks is an increased use of remote working environments. So one of the things I notice, one of the things lots of females notice probably, are whenever you join a call like this, you look at the faces on the screen. And I can't tell you how many meetings you join, and I'm the only person of color on those meetings because I deal with many executives across a variety of organizations. Now, we have to understand how do people feel when they enter a room and they're the only one who's different? Well, if you're not different, you will never notice. You will join that meeting and you will just act as if nothing is wrong. But if you are a female and you join a room of 30 people and everyone has a screen on and you realize you're the only one, if you're a person of color and you join a meeting, you might feel different. You might not, but you might. And so we're starting to realize that organizations now have an even more important role of being visible and articulating what their personal viewpoints are. We no longer have the water cooler discussions. We no longer have the ability to meet and talk to people who look like us. It's really up to organizations now to create a new way of working, a new sense of connectivity. And I'm really, really excited to hear about some of the other panelists today, a few who I know personally, because some of these people are just so passionate about what they do that I think they're going to be also able to provide some really good tips on ways to think.
Belton, thank you ever so much for that. I'm sure you'll come back in on some of these other topics as we go through. So, Grace, and if I could turn to yourself then, just reflecting on some of what Belton has said, you've recently published a report as part of your research, Virtual Inclusion in the City, which looks at the impact on inclusion of moving to a virtual environment. And so taking what Belton said and maybe some of the findings of your report, what are the D&I lessons and imperatives you think that business leaders should be considering at this time? And you're on mute, Grace.
Hi, sorry, I'm off.
Yes. That's all right.
So I agree with absolutely everything that Belton said. So the report that I wrote for the Inclusion Initiative was written just when we went into lockdown, when senior leaders was essentially scrambling to try to figure out how to bring inclusion into people's living rooms and into people's bedrooms when they were just starting to work at home. So I actually interviewed 35 senior leaders from the City of London across a wide range of firms. And these are leaders that actually believe in the value of inclusion. So what Belton said, I absolutely agree with. We do create happier workers when we have inclusive environments. But I think more than that, we also improve outcomes for the firm. So firms become more creative, they become more innovative, they serve their customers better, and P&L is better. So I basically targeted 35 leaders who had that ethos, so then would have wanted to have inclusion for the sake of the business. And actually, what I discovered through that process is that the obstacles that were faced by these people had something in common. But there was 40 obstacles that came out quite a lot. So it's quite a lot of obstacles. And also the solutions that both behavioral science, which is my discipline, brings, and the leaders themselves brought were very, very different. And this seems to be a theme that runs through inclusion and actually leadership in general, that there is no one answer, there is no silver bullet if you want to create an inclusive workforce, if you want to have all people belonging. But what you do need are the strong leaders that Belton referred to. And I would actually go a little bit further and say what we need is experimental leaders who are really conscious that what they're trying to do is create an inclusive workforce, and who are kind of thinking about what that actually means. And for me, it means two things. So it means the people who are around me today all feel comfortable to bring their ideas to me. And that's for me as a leader, because I'm getting to hear from lots of different voices and getting some great ideas. But second to that, that I'm constantly questioning who's at the table. And I'm looking at the pipeline and I'm looking to see who actually comes in. And I see these days that inclusion needs to move out of the human resources department and into the business, because if you are a leader in a company, it is your gift actually to be able to create an inclusive team, not for society's well-being, but for the betterment of the business and for the outcomes that you're actually bringing. And there is two tenets to that. The first is making sure that all voices are heard, and the second is making sure that your pipeline actually represents your customer base and represents voices in society. And I think what we're trying to do with the Inclusion Initiative is move human resources away from thinking of interventions that might work, because people have these kind of creative solutions. But once they have that great idea, teaching them how to see whether or not it actually is working. So measuring the effects and learning how much did I move my pipeline? How much did I increase voice? And just going back to the original question about Paul's original question about inclusion during COVID, I think the answer is we don't yet know what the effects of COVID has been on inclusion in workplace. My sentiment from looking around a lot of companies is that some are doing very well and some are doing very badly. And the only ingredient that I can identify that's common to the ones that are doing well is this experimental leadership. Those experimental leaders are doing different things, but their objective is always to enhance inclusion within the group.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I'll turn to some of those themes in a minute. And I guess before we go too far maybe down some of the solutions, can you just maybe give us an idea from your behavioral science perspective, what holds businesses back from being more diverse and inclusive? Like what are the fundamental things we're battling with here? Why isn't everyone as diverse and inclusive as possible? And maybe I'll come to some of the other panelists as well for your perspectives as well.
It's a really great question, Paul. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that hold people back. So I think the first is that sometimes firms don't take seriously that the pipeline and the people that are arriving to their door, that they have some responsibility in order to ensure that that's representative of all voices. And it's very easy for me to say as a leader, I have a pipeline problem. Well, if there's a pipeline problem, you go and fix it, because it's a problem for it's a problem for the business. I think the second thing is that if you're in a company that hasn't been inclusive for a very, very long time, there actually is some pain to moving towards a diverse and inclusive environment. And I think in a world where you have shareholders who are banging on the door looking for profits, it's very too easy to say that something is too difficult. And I think one of the best things about the time that we're actually living in now is that shareholders are changing, actually physical people, and changing their preferences. And they're seeing the value of inclusion, and they're seeing actually that this will bring us long-term gains. So what was once an excuse for not necessarily doing anything in a moment now is becoming less. But I think those are the two things. It's very easy to dismiss a pipeline problem as not being your own. And secondly, sometimes if you're in a toxic environment, moving towards more diversity and inclusion can be very, very difficult. But it is definitely worthwhile in the medium term and certainly in the long term.
So just on that then, a question just on the chat. What do you think some of the best metrics are for measuring how we progress in a sensitive and respectful way? Because we can talk about being diverse and inclusive, but often that's, actions speak louder than words there. So what are some of the best metrics that you've seen and others have seen to measure this?
So for me, one of the things that we hope to do in the Inclusion Initiative is actually come up with a credible measure of inclusion that basically captures what it means inside a firm to have an inclusive workforce, and also link that to profit and loss and to conduct risk. And we're doing that very strategically because we want basically shareholders to be aware of what inclusion is within firms. And I think next to that, what we need are the pulse points that are already being gathered within firms, which basically is what is gender composition, what is the race composition, what is the ethnicity composition, what is the LGBTQ composition within organizations, because these are pulses to see whether or not you actually have an inclusive environment.
Okay, Grace, thank you for that. Maybe Harry, turning to yourself then, because Grace has talked there, some of what Grace has mentioned is about outcomes, about business outcomes. And you, as a business leader and someone who now talks to a lot of CEOs, what are the key business outcomes you see from having a more diverse workforce and a more inclusive work environment?
It's a good question, and Grace and I have actually talked about this, and I think it's important for leaders to make a clear distinction between diversity and inclusion, because they tend to get put together as D&I initiatives. For me, and the one thing I've learned as a leader promoting diversity in the workplace is we have to be clear that diversity is a means to an end. It's a mechanism to achieve a culture of inclusion, a culture where, as Belton said, people feel comfortable to be themselves, to bring their best selves to work. And so the outcome you generate from that is that people are ultimately inspired, not just motivated, because motivated still has a self-interest to it, that they're inspired to actually perform at the highest standards possible. And they're actually doing it not just for the monetary rewards, not just because they're job and getting paid for it, but actually because they're genuinely inspired through the culture that they're working within. And then the other point I'd make, again, just having witnessed this from running businesses for over 20 years, is increasingly in frontline businesses, we were facing up as an organization, as a large financial institution, against clients on presentations and coverage assignments where the clients were becoming more diverse. There were more women, there were more people with gender diversity, ethnic diversity. And as a result, our business wasn't changing, and it became palpable. It wasn't just that we'd walk into a pitch and there'd be some elements of diversity. It became palpable that one side of the table were white men and the other side of the table were clearly more diverse. And it's just from anyone, if you had any remote sensitivity to it, locked in on that, and you could see that a business outcome to reflect how your clients were facing off to you.
Fantastic. Harry, thank you for that. I'd like to then maybe bring yourself in, Olive, just to share your perspective as well. We hear, Harry's messages around those outcomes that we're looking for, as well as from Grace and Belton around some of the initiatives and how we measure those. But how diverse are boards at this time? And in your mind, Olive, why do you think it's even more important that the tone from the top should be more diverse and more inclusive? You're on mute, Olive. No, you're still on mute. Let me see if I can unmute you.
Wasn't it? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. So I came over from the Caribbean when I was 6 and lived in the UK for 50 years. So I've lived with, racism and issues around it all my life. As a consultant, I opened my business in 1998 and had lots of challenges, you can imagine, because in 1998, most consultants were white males. I go along to a client and they say, is Olive coming then? And I say, well, actually, I'm Olive. So, lots of around that. Now, 21 years of working as a consultant. In the UK, I've only ever met 2 CEOs that were of colour, of a minority. And that's really, really rare. So from my point of view, the board is the beating heart of the business. The board makes decisions for the business. If there's no one on the board that represents me or someone of minority ethnic background, how can decisions be made that impact on me in a positive way? So it's important that we look at the board composition. Now, back to present day, we've done a lot of work around female board members, and the figures show that's working. Okay, I was part of the Alison Rose review of the government, put some money into female entrepreneurship, and that's working because the right focus. But unfortunately, black board members are regressing. The figures show that we're going down rather than up. Lots of reasons around that. Okay, and I think the nuts and bolts are around commonality, around a feeling of comfort. So some research in the CIPD shows that a lot of members have not got anybody in their life who is actually black, minority, ethnic. Yes. So if you have a discomfort about that person being part of your life and the conversation around it, how will you work on recruiting that person onto the board? There's conversation. They say to me, Olive, what do I say to them? How do I address them? Is it black, people of colour? Those basic things mean that comfort levels are limited. Okay, so that's one key thing, conversation. I also think it's only about business, it's about the media. Now, I've got a black son, so he's been stopped so many times in his car because he's driving a Merc as a black guy. So once again, the media, the way black men are portrayed is very negative. So we sit there, me and my husband, black children doing badly or kids doing badly, the black child, more violence, the black man. Single mothers, a black woman. So we're being fed this all the time by the media. So I think there's a responsibility for the media as well as business. And thirdly, my last point is schools. It starts with children. So the CIPD a while ago did some research into children wanting to have a career in HR, which was a big no-no for kids. Oh no, not HR, very negative. They put together a program called Steps Ahead program, went into schools and had somebody from HR mentoring children at school into the HR career. So once again, if we think about the issue around race and inclusivity, it has to start with the schools as well. Going into schools as business people, mentoring, coaching young children into a career with our organisation, sharing best practice, etc. So those are my 3-point attacks. It has to be media, business, and schools.
Olive, thank you so much for that. And that's a really good segue then, I think, into David, because that theme of focusing on schools, I think is an absolutely critical one that people, that will really resonate with their attendees. David, until very recently, you were working with Disney, and I'm sure Disney's been a presence in many a parent's living room over lockdown. And the programs that you choose to broadcast can play a huge role in a child's understanding of the world and how things fit together in that world. Can you just tell us then a little bit about how you've looked to create and celebrate diversity in the programming that children see, please?
Sure. So thank you. Thanks, Paul, and thank you for having me this morning. So part of Disney Channel's DNA thankfully for many years has been diversity, certainly on screen and with its characters across our different platforms. We have platforms that are focused towards older kids. We have platforms that are focused towards younger kids. We've had a range of diversity in regards to our lead characters for many of our shows and for our original movies. And over the last several years, we've made some really good strides in terms of adding LGBT characters into the mix. We still certainly have had some ways to go and have some ways to go with that. But over the past number of years, we introduced gay characters in some of our older skewing content. And then we've also had some examples of different types of families in our younger skewing content. So we're trying to make those the LGBTQ themes appropriate to the different age groups. It's been very important for us to be able to reflect back to the audience a range of faces and family types through our different shows. And we also take that very seriously within the company. One of my roles was executive sponsor of the LGBT resource group. The objective of the resource group was to be able to support LGBTQ employees and allies and be able to support the company's D&I initiatives. And I would say, in terms of just a practical tip, I think that you had mentioned, resource groups are a really great way to be able to motivate the employees and to be able to drive a company's D&I initiative. And if there are folks on the call that within their companies don't have resource groups, I think those are really a very strong first step to be able to engage the employees and also engage the executives as sponsors. And whether or not you're part of a group, to be an ally to a group is incredibly powerful.
David, thank you so much for that. So, Grace, if I may maybe turn back to you, because a lot of what we talk about today is cognitive. I think a lot of people on this call will agree that diversity and inclusion is a great thing to have, and yet we don't necessarily achieve it. And sometimes we hire and even surround ourselves with people who not only look like us but think like us as well. So, what role does unconscious bias play in how we operate as businesses, and what should we as leaders do about that?
So, if you're new to behavioral science, you can kind of think of it, there's two ways of thinking. So the first is really deliberate, where what I'm doing is quite strategic and I'm very, very aware of my actions. And the second is not so deliberate. I'm pretty much on autopilot. And the best estimates that we have about how we're actually using that brain throughout the day is 20% is strategic and 80% is this autopilot. And there's a lot of behavioral science literature that shows that some of the discrimination that we see within firms to groups that aren't like you, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, tends to operate through the unconscious. And when I talk about people who are not like you, as individuals, we tend to choose to live nearby. If you look at your neighbors, they tend to be like you with respect to the education that you have, age profiling. If you look at your neighbors and they don't look like you, I would ask you to kind of look again and pay attention to that. With marriage matching, traditionally, if you look at the labour force survey in Britain, we tend to marry people who have similar backgrounds to ourselves. And we tend to bring that to work. And it seems to be something about being on automatic pilot. And this is what unconscious bias is trying to address. So what you'll find within organizations when we do experiments on unconscious bias is that you have people who are saying that I want to hire very, very diverse individuals. And they might actually hire somebody who's of the opposite gender or a differential race. But when you kind of nail down, they tend to have much more similar life experiences than they have different. But the research, the theory of the firm tells us that that's actually bad for the firm. What you want is to have diverse voices, diverse perspectives. And actually what you want to do is break down that barrier that your gut reaction is to go with somebody who is quite like yourself. So for me, I would think that these kind of automatic actions that we haven't really got a handle on what proportion of it is driving these differences in firms yet. Because I think, unfortunately, today, because unconscious bias has become a buzzword, when people talk about differential outcomes, it's very easy to blame the unconscious rather than the conscious. So disentangling them when we rely on self-reports is very, very difficult. But we do know through experiments that it actually matters. And I think even more than that, when we think about individuals who actually come to us for interview, we also need to start now stripping away privilege. So I think, you know, some of the things that have been highlighted by the Black Matters movement have been this kind of extraordinary privilege that's given to white individuals, particularly men who are going through the financial professional services firms where I have domain expertise, and really thinking about what that means when you actually get a CV. So if I have been somebody who's had privilege for 10 years, I've probably been in the right networks, I've been around the right groups, and my CV essentially writes itself. But then if you get a CV from somebody who didn't happen to be in those networks, who didn't happen to be in those circles, who still arrives at your door, I would say that person is probably the person that you want to hire. The fact that they've actually gotten through the net to begin with is absolutely extraordinary. But very often, the outcome is in the first bucket. The outcome is the person who happens to be in the groups, who happens to be in the right circles. And again, that's done unconsciously. So pointing that out and really asking people to strip away what in a CV really signals to me skills, ability, and talent, and what signals to me that a person happened to be quite lucky or quite privileged throughout their lifestyle, and moving towards hiring people with skills, ability, and talent. It's so important. I'm losing my train of thought now because I feel actually very passionate about this, because I mean we hire too often on privilege as compared to skills, ability, and talent. And I think the type of work that I do, the experimental base, allows us to put architecture in place for people who really do want to have diverse and inclusive workforce, to strip away those automatic biases.
Can I come in here?
Of course you can, Olive.
So, great point, Grace. I think around recruitment, because I'm ex-recruitment myself, since the George Floyd situation has arisen, to me it's a blessing in disguise, awful as it is, because suddenly my neighbours are saying to me, Olive, what do I need to read to understand Black culture? How can I make sure my children are not growing up racist? And that's never happened before. And then I've had a flurry of clients ring me and say, we need training courses on diversity and inclusion, we need training courses on conscious bias. How can we put together a policy that makes sure that all staff are included, and so on? And then recruitment, they all say, I'd love to recruit someone Black, Olive, but we can't find anybody for the board or anywhere else. So within recruitment, I think we're trained to match what the client has already, rather than matching as to what the client needs next. So to get a quick placement, we think, who do they have normally, who will fit in easily, etc. And the discomfort of someone different, is a challenge. So one thing about recruitment is not only getting to the point where the organisation looks at that, but really the recruitment agencies as well must examine how they recruit people and how they actually put people forward for jobs.
And if I could just add on to that a little bit, I think one of the things I've seen through working with Pride in the City is we get asked that question quite a bit. How can we be more diverse? And one of the things I've seen, and this is probably what I've heard more from the legal sector, is we don't have enough people from ethnic backgrounds, and we just don't have them. And many say we've now put in a policy where we are interviewing an equal number of people who are from an ethnic background as those who aren't, but they're just still not making it through. And you hear that amongst lots of organizations, but I've now started to see a new type of organization who are being successful at recruiting. And what they're doing is they're going to schools. They're creating programs. They're going to children and saying, you can be a lawyer when you grow up. And they also recognize the value of having a diverse candidate. And this is just a very simple story, but I think it really gets the point driven home. There's a female I spoke to. She's a senior leader, runs diversity for a global organization, and she had a stay-at-home husband. They went out to dinner, and when they were choosing the restaurant, he said, these are the only 3 restaurants we can go to by our house. And she said, why? And he's like, well, because they're the only 3 with baby changing facilities in the men's bathroom. And if you think of that business opportunity for someone to create changing tables in the men's bathroom, what impact on revenues might that have had? So when people sometimes say we want to choose the best person for a role, the best person for a role might be someone who looks different simply because they look different and they're going to bring new ways of working that you've never thought of.
But Belton, that's a fantastic point, and I would just like to reflect. I think there's a lot of comments coming from the chat, and I will try and get to them. There's a very reasonable challenge that's come in from I think Benedict, kind of just highlighting to what extent even on this forum have we had a diverse group of people of colour. I mean, I would stress that, particularly last week and other weeks as well, we have had people from all range of backgrounds on this, but that is something we absolutely strive to do because it is so important, and we do shine a light up to ourselves and on that. But Layla, maybe if I could come to you just on that, because we're talking here about recruitment and about recruiting people from diverse backgrounds and allowing them to break through those glass ceilings. And often very real ceilings. Can you just give us some stats that you've seen from a recruitment perspective around kind of how the world has changed over the last few years?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing senior placement since 2005, and I think back then we had different types of legislation that were coming in. Age discrimination legislation was a real focus at the time. So I think we've got to recognise that we have evolved as a society and as a workplace, and we now, for example, have 5 generations in the workplace. People come into work at the age of 16 and they're not leaving in some cases until they're in their mid 70s. So we have evolved in some areas, but clearly BAME, women in leadership, LGBTQ are still areas that we're working towards, and there's been I agree with the sentiments, there's been a huge focus. So to talk about some of the stats, in August last year, there was a report chaired by Trevor Phillips, who's head of the Equality Watchdog, looking at the makeup of company boards and senior management, particularly in the FTSE. It found that directors and executive committee members from BAME backgrounds in the FTSE fell from 8.8% in 2018 to 7.4% in 2019. And it's a similar type of number in the senior management in the FTSE 100. Just measuring the top 100 managers in the FTSE businesses, the BAME representation, so ethnic minority managers, made up 10.7% of the top 100 staff. That was largely similar from the year before, 2018. So why is that? We've heard some of the reasons why. What can we do about it? In recruitment, particularly, on exec search level, we do get asked for representation from different groups, predominantly female, more recently BAME, and therefore we are looking for people. So yes, there is a disconnect between the types. Sometimes the companies recognizing themselves that they need to do some more work around to increase their ability to attract those candidates to even come for interview in the first place. So, to Oliver's point, to Grace's point, yes, you need to have representation on the board, both at executive and non-executive level, and you need to have representation at the senior management, in the senior management team, before you can even start to say, we would like a female on the board, or we would like someone of a BAME background. The environment for that candidate to come and even interview with your business needs to be comfortable, appealing, the values need to be there. And when you're onboarding that candidate, and that's what a candidate is looking at, when you're onboarding that candidate, how comfortable do I feel in this environment? Do they have a number of other people that I can go and speak to, be mentored by, feel comfortable in meetings with? Is there an LGBT group, that I can connect with? Are there some similar peers, or if not, do I feel supported in bringing that new initiative and type of innovation to this business?
And thank you, Layla. And Harry, if I may turn to you then, because that concept of support, once people have joined, it's so easy for us as businesses then to alienate people, particularly in the virtual environments in which we now work. One of the biggest challenges over the last 16 weeks is that more people than ever are working from home. And so What are your thoughts around how business leaders can make that home working and virtual meeting experience just provide some of that support and some of that, addressing some of those themes that Grace, Belt and Olive have mentioned, just to make sure that once people are in, they're feeling as included as possible?
It's another good question, because I was contacted through my network relatively early on in lockdown, and primarily with the still emerging leaders within my network. They became quite concerned that the modern office was quite an equalizing environment, particularly a trading floor, open plan offices. Leaders were visible, they were accessible, people came up the list together, they went down the list together. And then once we went into a working from home environment, well, the technologies were adopted very quickly. So there was some really positive elements of collaboration and innovation. Very quickly, people started to feel a sense of insecurity and isolation, particularly because certain colleagues who may be better paid or more senior were clearly operating from much more comfortable surroundings. And that was visible because of the video technology. And where you're in an office environment and you're going to client presentations together, you're working in groups together, you may be working in an agile lab together, you're sharing experiences. Once you go into a working from home environment, everyone's experience can be quite different. And it's really challenging to create those shared experiences that create a more inclusive culture. And so in talking to my network, and I collected a number of quotes, which I'm happy to share with the group because I didn't attribute them. And you can really see the issues that were arising, insecurity about where an individual was presenting from, for example, in a very small flat, or if there were small children and there was noise in the background. And also the elements of the background, but it's also the elements of having the option or an employer asking for consent for an employee to join with video. It might be suitable for that employee to join with voice only because they had to go into a very small room to be able to attend that meeting. And so, in effect, there could be protocols that could create a more inclusive environment, such as using neutral backdrops for everyone participating in a meeting, or seeking consent to actually go to video. And so this axiom that I came up with, which was that consent equals respect. Just one other comment I wanted to make, because I've been making notes and there were some very good linkages to make here on this element of schooling, which Olive brought up, and I've talked about pipeline. And just to be clear, what I just described as some very quick tactical changes that could happen on the working from home environment could change the inclusive culture. However, many of the aspects of broader diversity and inclusion initiatives, particularly having more diverse boards, more diverse pipelines, those are very long-term planning exercises. There are no quick wins in that respect. And it's also something that I struggled with as a leader, not making sufficient progress. And actually what led me to create the RBC Academy, which brought the company into the schools and started actually recognizing that many of the students, particularly those of ethnic backgrounds, were taking courses that were focused on medicine and law, because that was seen as the highest echelon for people within those ethnic backgrounds to achieve. And so they weren't starting with the right A-level courses to prepare them for university, which then could get them into banking, for example. And so you think about it, we were starting with students who were 16 and 17 years old and supporting them all the way through uni with scholarships and internships, so that by the time they were 21 or 22, so 5 years later, they're then joining the workforce as graduate trainees. You have to think long term.
Yeah, Harry, absolutely.
Sorry, can I make one point about schooling? I'm going one step before the 16-year-olds. When I was at school in Blackburn, Lancashire, I asked they did history on kings and queens of England, and it was wonderful. Henry VIII, all the rest of the beautiful gowns. And I said, as the only black child in the whole school, I said, "Excuse me, sir, what's my history, please, as a black person?" He said, "Come here, love, come here." He said, "See that slave ship there? Those people lying there like sardines, that's your history. You came on the slave ship and that was it." I was crushed. So as you can imagine, I'm a strong personality. I was able to pick myself up from that. But if we're starting, even at school, with history, sharing our shared history, making it more positive, making it inclusive, so children get some pride in themselves before they get to that age and they feel more confident.
Yeah, absolutely. Olive, thank you so much for that. I see a comment on the side, I think from Darren, around kind of, I think, challenging us today, and that's fantastic, around whether we're using a narrow definition of diversity, gender and race, because the topic covers so much more, from regional accents, which university we attend, single parent family, socioeconomic background, and also disabilities. And I think we aren't, despite our heady aims, we aren't going to manage to cover everything today. But I am delighted that Liz has joined us again from last week, who joined us last week. Liz is as you may remember, is a Paralympic athlete, won gold in Beijing, and now runs a company called The Ability People. And Liz, I just wondered if you wanted to come in off that reflection from Darren, and also some of those educational comments that Oliver's made as well, just to bring a short perspective, from your world.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry to gate crash. I think everybody's made some really amazing points, and I think that's the reality with diversity and inclusion is, as a point was made earlier, everybody's trying to do the right thing, and everybody's beating the drum, but collectively, often what happens is people focus on certain areas or certain demographics, but actually, and the point has already been made, that in order to get authentic inclusion, if you get inclusion, diversity is a byproduct of that. But so often we focus on different areas, and actually what we do come at it from a disability angle, because again, lots of people mention lots of things, and every now and again someone will say disability, but it's like it's the bottom of the list of demographics, because to Olive's point, there's less expectation of somebody with a disability, rightly or wrongly. It's there, and it does stem from schooling, because years and years ago, people didn't go to mainstream schools, were segregated, and therefore a lot of people who are currently running organizations or boards and making operational decisions don't appreciate or understand how somebody with a disability could possibly do that job, because they weren't in my maths class, or they didn't even come to my school. So how is that possible? So everybody's point is relevant, but I think it starts with that in order to address, and to go to Darren's point, address inclusion as a whole, the underpinning theme is normalizing difference, because actually on this call, 50% of people are wearing glasses, right? Now that isn't normal. We're not born with glasses on, and actually some people choose to wear glasses with plain glass in. We've all done that before. But the point is, like, nobody bats an eyelid at people wearing glasses now. It's an accepted difference. And actually, by normalizing differences, it brings everything that everybody has said together, and actually it underpins diversity. It creates diversity and creates inclusion, because everybody's right. You need role models, and a lot of what I do is, in my former Paralympian role, is athlete mentors, with young people, because people didn't have role models who were different. Like, that's a point that's also been made.
Yeah.
And even when you do, you look at what is visible, and actually disability is invisible. 70% of disabilities are invisible, and actually quite inhibiting, because people get anxious. But the one thing about disability is, I'm never going to be black, and I'm heterosexual, so I'm never going to be like in the LGBT community. But we all empathize with how people feel to be treated unfairly. But anybody can become disabled at any time. And actually that doesn't stop us. So it's about, I think it's about helping people understand that it's good, different is good, and difference is normal. Yep. And actually, to bring everything that everyone else has said, those things that diversity creates, it gives companies and societies a competitive advantage. But if it's done as a token gesture, it actually has a negative effect, because like you said, you don't want to be just given a seat at a table because of how you look or what box you tick. You want to know that you are valued in those discussions. So yeah, that's my point, I guess.
Liz, thank you ever so much for that. I think the concept of normalizing those differences is absolutely going to resonate. And I think just on that, I think I'd just, in the interest of time, I'd like to just bring the threads together that we've had today and look to the future and just ask each of our panelists, what is the one thing that as employers, as people, we should do or change to make our workplaces more inclusive environments? Belton, I'll come to you first, if I may. I know that's something you speak very passionately around within Protiviti. So can you give us what's your top tip? What's the top thing that people should take away today to make our workplaces more inclusive environments?
I would say try to move understanding to secondary to listening. So many people don't get the Black Lives Matter movement right now, but I'm not saying you have to. I'm saying there's people coming from all around the world telling you that they're experiencing challenges in their life that you can't understand. So instead of trying to understand it, instead of trying to say, oh, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, instead of worrying about any of that, try to just listen to what they're saying.
Well, Belton, that's very powerful. Thank you ever so much for that. David, can I ask you to reflect on that, please?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to do is to be able to educate yourself, particularly around groups that you might not have direct association with, and particularly now as we're all separated from each other, we don't have those water cooler moments. Being able to find those resources to be able to understand a little bit more. There's lots of great resources, particularly around the BLM movement. And again, I not to bang on the resource group drum, and there was a question about how those are formed, whether it's HR directed or comes from employees. Our experience has been that it's best when it comes from employees, but supported by HR. Yeah. So being able to create a framework to be able to allow employees to start them is something that HR can do. But at the end of the day, it coming from employees, and it can come from employees at different levels. That's really an effective way. And just one last bit to just say, in terms of the intersectionality of things, to be able to have resource groups that having different kinds of resource groups within an organization, and those groups working together can really generate incredible benefits for the company, because they're just amplifying each other's work. And at Disney, we had some really great events during our Pride Month that we had planned months prior with our diversity group, which was our BAME group, with our women's group. And they just, they happened to come out to be such incredible events because they were joined at such an incredible time and had been planned months before. Mm-hmm. So I cannot stress that enough, to be able to give employees that voice.
And I think so I understand, often these things are planned, but also I think within organizations, we can sometimes have those, what we call those water cooler moments as well. And Belton, I know you've been a big fan of those, where just that coming together of people and creating that opportunity for people to come together, particularly in virtual environments, can be so important. Olive, may I come to you next? What's the top thing that people should do here to increase diversity and inclusion in the workplace? What's your top tip?
Okay, I've been around a long time, lots of talking, action is what's needed. So I think from a business point of view, we need to focus on this with regard to policies, strategy, written into the culture of the organisation. Because if it's written into the policy and the strategy for the business, it works all the way down the business, and that's where we'll see effective change. No more talking, let's have some definite action. Because I've noticed over the years, when we work together this way with regard to the values, the mission, the vision of the organisation is woven around this issue, it actually has a cultural change and it's embedded. So it's not a training course, but a whole programme around this, including strategy and policies.
Actions louder than words. Thank you, Olive. Grace, am I come to you?
Yes, absolutely. So I would like to move from Olive's, stay on Olive's point, is to link actions to changing the narrative. So we talked today about normalizing difference. I would really like the narrative to change that difference is actually really, really good for business. And that if I'm a leader and I don't have difference in the room when I'm creating problem-solving solutions, then I'm actually failing the business. And I think that's really, really important. But I think secondly, and I've seen this happen a lot through the Black Lives Matters movement, that when somebody is telling you a story about their experience, that you don't put yourself into that story. You're not a star of that story in that particular moment. And I think that's our reflex reaction when we hear a bad story. What can I do about it? How can I change it now? But I think listening to the story, recognizing the pain and reflecting on it, how would I have felt if I was in that moment? And Olive was very brave and shared with us today, and that's what I will be thinking about later on. How would I have felt if I was in that moment?
Absolutely.
Being a young Olive. And I think we don't do that enough. We put ourselves straight away in the story as the solution. And I think that speaks to diversity. And one thing that I've learned a lot actually from the Black Lives Matters movement is the need to really hear those stories and hear the diversity of stories, so that I will know the next time if something like that is happening in my presence and stop it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Harry?
Yeah, just to follow on from that, from my perspective, leaders and organizations need to accept that they're facing challenges. They should not just be coming out and saying, we know that society's facing this challenge, here's what we're doing about it. It's actually to acknowledge as leaders and as organizations that we're facing challenges. Be humble, be authentic, and focus on, as Olive says, what actions are we going to take, or the fact that we may have not decided on which actions we're taking because we're consulting with employees. It's met with such a positive response that people feel that they're included in the discussion, as opposed to the organization going on the front foot and saying, let us tell you about all the things that we're doing. That's met with more cynicism.
Absolutely. Harry, thank you so much for that. As ever, I'm getting told off because we're out of time, and I do apologise. Later, I know we wanted to come in for some recruitment top tips as well. We will keep the lines open for more informal discussion and networking, our weekly after party. I would like to say I'm overwhelmed by the responses and the questions, everything coming through on the chat. It's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. I really hope this has been of use to everyone. It certainly feels as though it has, and it certainly feels like the discussion can go on and on because it is such an important topic for us. Next week, we are looking at regional development, our towns and our cities, and how COVID in the last 17, 18 weeks has caused us to maybe kind of reassess the priorities around cities and how we look at our regions. But before we get to there, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our scheduled panelists and all our impromptu panelists, Liz, as well. Thank you so much for coming on to all of you. Your perspectives have been fantastic. And David, once again, thank you so much. I hope you can go back to bed or to bed, or I'm not quite sure how you've worked.
I am.
Thank you ever so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions to the attendees. Really grateful. Apologies if I didn't get to them as ever, but I hope I got to as many. We sincerely hope within Protiviti and Robert Half that this forum's been useful for you, and you can apply some of the thoughts you've heard today to your businesses. So on behalf of my colleagues at Protiviti and Robert Half, I'd like to extend our best wishes to you all. Stay safe, be kind to each other, be inclusive, and we look forward to meeting with you all again very, very soon. But as I say, please stay on if you have the time. Thank you ever so much, everyone.
Nice to meet everybody. The best.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
It feels as though the engine should maybe whir down like a plane kind of coming into land or something now. But no, thank you all very much for staying on. As ever, I can see some familiar faces from Paul and others who are there. So this is now over to you. Even more so, I know that some people may have had their hands up, and there's lots of open questions I didn't get to. Stephen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've worked for quite a few different companies. I've got lots of different social circles, cycling, NCT groups and whatnot. But 99% of the time, I'm just met with people of similar background to myself. So I don't have the situation of actually being able to either include or do diversity. So our social circles, our mixes aren't coming together. How do we change that graph? I can't just go out and find people to recruit from different ethnic backgrounds.
Layla, is that one you want to start with? As I know we didn't manage to get to your kind of recruitment top tips, but to Stephen's point there of how does he actually engage and recruit people from different ethnic backgrounds, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's there's a couple of things. There's the business's ability that there are we have a huge range of geographical and sectorial influences, I would say, that either benefits or impacts on a company's ability to hire in a truly diverse way. We have to look at that. To Ola's point earlier, she's grown up in Blackburn in Lancashire. Well, actually, there's a very strong Asian community. One of the businesses up there, Euro Guarantees, actually have a kind of a prayer. Well, they have not a kind of a prayer room, but they actually open up to other people in the community. So actually, that's become an attraction to other businesses. In that, there's a number of things you can do. But if you're talking, I don't know where you're based, Stephen, but if you're in London and you're in financial services or you work in banking or something like that, typically those businesses attract a wide range. If you're in a very small and niche company, that can be difficult. One of the things that we're exploring at Robert Half, and that's becoming more prevalent, is the use of technology to get around conscious and unconscious bias. So taking the concept of psychometric testing, which again plays into, and I've seen some chat on the sidebar about self-selection, because you have to answer the questions about how great you are or some of your perceived weaknesses or strengths, is looking at the gamification, just focusing on personality traits, which is becoming a bit of a leveler to cover all areas of D&I. So that would get around, colour, ethnicity, sexual orientation, single parent, location, accents. It mitigates everything, because it's an online game that just measures personality traits. And if a company can identify through the values the types of personality traits that they would like to focus on for particular areas or parts of their business, then actually just measuring those, it's a bit like The Voice versus the X Factor. If you're familiar with that, you hear the voice first, but you don't see the person, and you're just judging and measuring the voice as opposed to the full package. And then the judges hit the button, and their chair turns around and they see the whole package. So that's one area that we're exploring, and we're close to, and that a lot of organisations are using to help with that. So I don't know if that helps, Stephen.
Can I ask about the personality traits? So, is there some worry that this is going to compound the issues that we have already? So, for example, one of my PhD students is doing work on the rewards that personality traits get within the labour market. And at the moment, all she's looked at is gender. But it shows that men are rewarded for different personality traits as compared to women. So the idea that a company is demanding a particular type of personality trait really troubles me, actually. And I think some of the differences that we've ended up with, the segregations in the market, comes from companies having these kind of McKinsey style approach to saying, actually, there's a particular type of personality trait that's good for a particular job, and those are the people that we're going to have to find.
Yeah.
Socialization tells us that we get socialized into our personalities, right?
So I've got my daughter who's just started online lessons in the background. So there's another teams going on in the background. I agree, Grace. Look, I mean, having been a female working in senior leadership for a long time, I've read all sorts of books. The phenomenon of imposter syndrome and leaning in are not unfamiliar to me. I've had to do a lot of leaning in and walk into a room. Every year I go to events and they are up to 1,000 people, and there's probably 900 men in the room and 100 women. And so the personality traits between all people. No, actually, some of the. So one of the businesses we're working with is Arctic Shores. They are developing. So they will develop a profile for the particular job, or for an organisation, particular levels across an organisation. And it's not that someone is being rewarded for having one personality trait. It's a makeup of personality traits being measured of about 20, and a company is looking for. They've identified that they need these particular 10 personality traits to be successful in that role, or because they want to increase the cognitive diversity within their organisation or within their team. So it's a measurement of a number of personality traits, and the combination of those personality traits that makes either an individual or a team successful, and therefore contributing to an organisation.
You're on mute, Paul.
Belton, Harry, just before we come to Arvind, who I know has got his hand up for some time, but any any responses to Stephen's question?
No, you go first. Here.
Oh, sorry. No, go Belton, you go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think two things. One, if you find yourself frequently in a situation where when you look around the table, you don't see diversity, I think step one is, how can I change that? Because one of the questions in the chat was, I work in technology and there's not many people around me. And that's because we typically have a huge referral scheme where we refer our friends and people typically look like us. So maybe change how the referral structure looks or who you're engaging with. Two, there are tons of organizations dedicated to empowering people of various backgrounds, whether it's female, LGBT, or BAME, to really empower them to, I guess, find roles, particularly in industries that aren't as pervasive. So I say do a little bit of looking into those types of organizations. And then three, I think it does come back to cost. An organization will invest in partnering with a potential recruitment firm if they do have a true desire to influence the change in their organization. But the only way you get things like that funded is if you recognize the value and the potential increased revenue and or transformation from the different way of thinking that will come as a result of your investment in those people, which is typically the most challenging obstacle to overcome.
Yeah, again, I go back to my comments on the closing main session. It's about actually recognizing that you've got a problem, recognizing that you're facing a challenge, and then seeking people and the advice of people who can help you address that. Again, no quick fixes.
Yeah. Thank you, Harry. Arvind, I know for some time you've had your hand up, and apologies I didn't manage to get you before. What would you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a great session. Couple of points, one is, I mean, I was reading at Sir John Parker's report. Clearly shows underrepresentation of diversity from a race point of view in FTSE list, especially below FTSE 100. That's quite appalling, considering the requirement was having at least one director, and many don't even have one. That's one aspect. When looking at my own experience, I'm a graduate from a good top business school in the world. I'm a Big Four accountant. I've done management accounting. I've done double qualifications on top of that, work with big blue chip companies, had strong experience. But what I've found myself time and again is not being shortlisted for roles where actually I tick off more boxes than actually are required, and I still apply for those roles, and I come back with a lot of excuses and reasons. However, my success rate is much higher when I go direct, when I apply directly. So one I feel is there is not enough representation within the recruitment community to recognize the problem. So when they shortlist and send, I have a feeling that they would shortlist people that they feel will be successful in the role without having enough time to understand how others can succeed in the role. I think it's a shortcut of past success which is not being changed. And so when I look at my children and I tell them that go and get good grades and you'll have a successful life, and I look at my own self and I feel, wow, I've got probably the #1 qualification in the world, and I'm finding it difficult to get a job which I should easily get. So, I mean, how do I break this glass ceiling? What's your suggestion?
Shall I jump in there? Well, look, one thing I would say, Arvind, I completely agree with you. I think it's actually about identifying with there's something about connection with the person you're interviewing with. I don't know about the profile of headhunters that you've met or within recruitment firms. I mean, recruitment as a sector is relatively diverse, actually, in all areas that we've talked about today. But one thing that I think I notice is that when you go through a headhunter, ultimately the client is the client. And if the client wants to make a decision, it's about the headhunter's ability to influence and advise the client. I'm fairly direct. I can say what I want, but ultimately when a client is paying for a service, they will always have the ability to trump advice given by a headhunter. That is a dynamic that is, going to be prevalent in a professional services, like not in accountancy, but in our industry. So actually, you are dependent on the headhunter's individual ability to advise with credibility to a client, which maybe explains why you're having more success when you go directly and connect with someone directly in HR or in talent acquisition. So maybe that goes some way. Not particularly helpful, but maybe your assessment of the headhunters that you work with, there's a layer of extra due diligence there. That's possibly what one of the reasons why.
I think as well, Grace, it goes to some of the points you were making around conscious and unconscious bias there as well. I think, as I say, Arvind, it's difficult to tell, obviously, from what you said, whether what's playing there. But Grace, I think that kind of ties in quite a lot with what you were saying earlier on that topic.
I mean, I don't have any kind of clear advice about how to buck the trend. I think the CEOs recognizing and executives recognizing that actually having diversity and inclusion members on their board is a good thing is absolutely the first step. What you have said, actually, I identify with, because I work with a CEO quite closely who recently was hiring onto their board, and all the recruiter gave to them was white men, basically back into the pile, even though he had actually asked for diverse representation across 8 different strata. All he actually got back was white men, and the headhunter actually said, all that's out in the market is white men. And he said, well, I know that not to be true, so I'm going to go and look myself and actually meet people. And I think there needs to be more of that, because if the headhunter's incentive is to just do exactly what was done before, that's what the headhunter is going to do. But if you have senior people saying, I want to have diversity across 8 different strata, so it's properly diverse, because I know the skills and ability aren't differentiated across those groups. So that's the real talent pool, and really pushing somebody to get that. It's only then I think we're not going to be having the problem that you're reiterating today. But I think Layla has the best advice for kind of bucking the trend, which essentially is kind of a warm introduction directly into the company. But I think for people like me, the work that we have to
quite go that far, Grace. I don't want to do my industry answer myself, but no, you're right. I think it's finding someone to connect with. So actually, even whether it's with the company or whether it's with a search firm, I think connecting with someone, they are representing you, they're getting to know you. And so, conscious and unconscious bias rackets run all the time, according to whatever we're doing, whether we're in a shop, whether we're trying to find a job, they are there all the time. But I think there's more education that needs to happen, across the search sector. In London in particular, it is still quite traditional, and you still got the old boys network.
On suggestion, sorry, if I may. What if resumes don't have name attached to it? What if they have been submitted just purely based on experience qualification?
So in behavioral science, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the resume blinding works, which is really exciting. But all of that has been done on low wage jobs where CVs aren't that differentiated. So we don't actually have university qualifications. And actually, some of the folk who've brought in the blinding for the higher level senior managing director jobs have found backfiring effects. Because when you blind the name and you blind addresses and you blind racial profiling and ethnicity, what's left is the cover letter. And people who know they're going into a blind audition will use the cover letter to signal the type of things that actually, so they'll use things like talk about being in a boys' school, for example, and that straight away tells you that you're a man, and actually the school itself tells you a lot about where the person actually came from. So at the very top level of jobs that you're actually seeking for, the evidence is really, really mixed with a lot of backfiring effects.
I'd like to just kind of bring in some others, because there are a lot of hands up. Oh, sorry, Harry. Sorry.
Yeah, just on the recruitment element as well. I've literally hired thousands of people in organizations, hundreds of people directly for me. You've got to be thinking about your diverse channels for recruitment, which include your external network, as Grace talked about, your internal sourcing of talent, and then your what I call third-party external, which is going through recruiters. And you find where you end up having a lack of diversity because you're too focused on one of those, say, 3 primary channels.
Yeah. Peter, I know everyone's very polite this morning. Peter, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Richardson. I'm responsible for Protiviti in the UK. I just wanted to make a plea on behalf of some of our less extrovert and less, if I can put it this way, because I said exactly the same to my own management, our less gobby friends who are polite enough to put their hands up. And let's try and include some of those as well, please, because it's not always easy for all our friends to get their comments in. I know it's a slightly odd environment in an after party to have to raise your hand to make a comment, but I know that a few people have, and I think it's really interesting news that we do tend sometimes to end up with 9 of us who are chatting away and 35 of us behind the scenes who can't get a word in edgeways. So I'm just making a plea on behalf of some of our hand raised colleagues.
Absolutely. And Nadella, I think you had your hand up, Nadella?
Yes, I did. Bear with me, my 3-year-old daughter is sitting on my lap, so she might come in while I'm actually speaking. So I'm just going to add on to what Arvind said and what Leila, you added on to what he said as well. And I'll just give an example as a client. So basically, I was recruiting for an internal audit manager, and I wasn't getting the caliber of CVs I needed. And I was worried. I was wondering what's going on in the market. And recruiters assured me that I was getting the best CVs. Then, for some reason, another recruiter provided me with a good CV and said they couldn't give it to me because there's conflict. Another recruiter had presented this person's CV. I found out that this person hadn't. The CV was suppressed. And in the end, I ended up hiring that person through another agency. So I guess it's also, as you mentioned, Leila, the credibility of the recruiters. There's one thing having a rapport with your recruiters, but recruiters also have a responsibility to actually provide personnel to teams. So I was quite disappointed, and sometimes I get a bit sensitive when I'm dealing with recruiters now. So that has damaged the trust in some recruiters. So it's a very, very important aspect. So Arvind, your point is right in terms of, there are instances where CVs do get suppressed, and I've got evidence. And my case in terms of where I ended up hiring this person was fantastic, just by chance, because another recruiter provided that CV. So I guess it's relevant for Robert Half, for example, because you guys need to keep the credibility of your practice itself. I do a lot of stuff with Protiviti, and I'll choose Protiviti before choosing any of the big 4 firms. So Robert Half, challenge is on you now.
That's very good to hear.
Thank you. We'll take it on.
I'd like to come to Belton and then Lisa, as you got your hand up as well. Belton.
Yes, I guess what I really just wanted to respond to Arvind's point as well. I think a lot of what we heard today has really been on what can recruiters and organizations do. But I think if you're someone who's really, really trying to make a difference, what can you do to inject yourself into that senior leadership? And I think it's really interesting because I know Pride in the City, we work with Involve, the membership organization I mentioned earlier, and I know they partnered with McKinsey to do a leadership executive training program. And they taught you tips that you could use that could make you more successful in that process. And I know some of the things that I personally look to use is external organizations. So external organizations always have boards, and they always have members that are publicly available, and they have patrons. And if you volunteer with an organization for 6 months and you're relatively senior, there's a high likelihood that you're going to meet those types of individuals. And so if we're really trying to break into that upper level where we may not have those senior leaders in our personal network, I would recommend try to find ways to get personal introductions to someone before you apply, talk to them about their role, and then try to apply through a recommendation from that person. Because what so many people have that others don't is that personal network. And then the question that I'll have for Grace, maybe after Lisa talks, is Grace, from what I see, many organizations are now moving to an online application model. And by using that online application model, we're moving to AI and other technologies auto-filtering people out of that process. How can we make sure that there's more level playing field to allow potentially someone who might come from a different background, who may not have that same level of support, to make it through that radar? But maybe we can go to Lisa before you respond to them.
No,
thanks, Belton. I appreciate it. I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because unconscious bias in the programming in the first place is a whole different topic. But just to make the point that I was going to make, I think I really think that the long term and the broader perspectives of the conversations today have been really important. I think the one thing for me that I think feels exclusive at the moment is the fact that people struggle to choose the right language to be inclusive in the first place. And I just kind of want to make the point, all of these subsets of the conversation are absolutely great, but until we have an ability to embrace and promote language easily that comes to the front of our mind without having to think, oh, check, have I thought about this? To really make sure that we normalise embracing all of the difference around us, I think it's really, really tricky. So I think that short term, we could really do with some good, thoughtful, well-promoted, easy ways to think about how to bring everybody together with the perspective of diversity and inclusion in an accessible way. Because at the moment, unfortunately, in my life, as a broad embracer of anybody and everybody, I often come across this situation where the language choice highlights the difference as opposed to creates an inclusive environment. And I just think it's something we could really do with solving.
I think that's I think that's at the heart of this, I think, Lisa, because I think, you know, I'm sure a lot of people on this forum today have almost the best of intentions, but that language and those actions, and I think Harry and Harry and others, you all mentioned the kind of actions will speak louder than words on this, and language is a key part of that.
I agree with that. I eliminated terms like move the ball forward. The HR group used a term called enterprise athlete. This language was so divisive in the way it was approached, and it was so commonly used. Put the puck in the net. Just primarily these sporting analogies were so male and so white, and you've just got to have the courage as the leader to step up and say, we're going to stop doing this, and I'm gonna start as the leader, but you need to be bold with these things and set signals.
I think Grace, and you use the term experimental leaders as these
and I think, to speak to Lisa's point, I mean, the framing is really important, right? So I kind of, this happened to me very, very recently. I've been invited to be on 2 different committees. So the first committee really asked me to be on there as a behavioral scientist, given that I have a comm background. And the second committee, it was very clear that I was filling a gender quota, not just to me in the email that they sent as the invite, but also to everyone else around the table. So it's probably no surprise to you, because I accepted both to see what would happen as a personal experiment. And it's probably no surprise that my voice in the committee, where I was actually being brought on as an expert with different skills and ability, was much bigger. And we do this all the time. We talk about, let's make sure that there's enough, women in boardrooms. But why do we want women in boardrooms? It's actually because they bring differential perspectives to the people that are already there. And it strikes me as weird that we have CEOs running huge companies today that want to have people who are like them around the table. Because, if I'm solving a problem today, if I get 7 more Graces, I may as well not bother paying their salary, to be very honest. So I think really kind of turning that on its head, that the inclusion is actually is really good for business, and stopping the kind of language of let's put a woman on the committee, or let's make sure that we have people of a certain race in the room at a particular time, and emphasizing their value in that particular moment. That change of the narrative, it's really, really important. Otherwise, we will have people who will keep saying, there's not people with that characteristic out there, that's why they're missing. We don't have the pipeline effects. I think it's a really good point, Lisa. Thank you for bringing it up.
No, I think it's key. It happens to me a lot as well, particularly the gender card. But this week I had someone approach me, I think I wrote it in the comments, but I had someone approach me this week because they wanted to find some BAME training. Again, it kind of makes you cringe inside, but the perspective is, the understanding and the choice of language is fulfilling a need in a particular way, not considering the whole perspective and actually the performance attributes that you're looking to get out of having a great team around a table, all with a voice that's listened to. So yeah, I just think we miss a trick. I'm not saying it's easy, but we have to try to shift the argument so that it's focused on the right things.
And some of this actually links to Belton's point, though it mightn't actually be obvious. So the idea of that we have AI and why AI actually fails. I mean, AI is built by humans, and most of the algorithms all of the algorithms that I've seen are programmed based on who's actually been successful in a role in the past. So if we think about who's been successful in a role in the past, they've been successful for two reasons. So first, they have skills and ability. But second, there's probably been a privilege or luck, or they happen to be in circumstances that got them into that position in the first place. And I think if we really want to have good AI, and this is why I made the comment about the personality, by the way, if we really want to have good AI, we need to be stripping out that privilege aspect and really just focusing on skills, ability, and talent. Because very often it's signals that actually don't matter for actually doing a job that get people into high profile jobs. So I think for AI, we have to look back and see what are the tasks that people need to do in the job. And of course, if we're talking about an executive suite, we do need to have differential perspectives if they're going to serve their customers and their shareholders well. But that's going to be hard. I think rethinking all of that is going to be difficult.
Absolutely. I'm aware we're at 1:30. This can absolutely continue. I don't know how much time people have, but I'm very, very grateful, particularly for our panelists for staying on. Any other questions? I can see Dan, Darren, Gary, lots of others in the bar. Any other questions, reflections for our panelists? Okay. Well, look, very, very, very grateful for you all taking the time. I really hope this has been useful, and it's very good to meet you all. So I think if there's not anything else, we'll wrap things up there. But look, as I say, very good to meet you all. Thank you ever so much for your time, and look forward to catching up soon. This discussion could run on and on, I think, for another day. But it's and I think that's testament to everything you put into it. So thank you.
Thanks so much. See you all.
Thank you. Thank you. See you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.